Please join me in welcoming Jenny.
Thank you so much. I'm so delighted to be here and see such a wonderful turnout. I'm excited to talk about this important topic with you. As Harley said, my name is Jenny Buckley. I'm proud to be one of the nurses with Weinstein Hospice and palliative care. And one of the hats that I wear is to go out and meet different patients and families to whom hospice and palliative care has been maybe recommended. And I even see some familiar faces in this room. I love the opportunity to do that. And every day, one of the best parts of my job is that I get to learn more than I teach. And in the last several months, several years, very often when I go out and meet with a new patient or family, I get questions about medical marijuana, about CBD oil. I meet with someone and I see their pill box at the bedside, and then I see an extra little basket. What's in the basket, Mrs. Jones? Oh, my grandson brought that for me. I won't talk about that. But what is it? Everybody's talking about it. There's signs all over the community. There's articles everywhere you look. What's a gummy? What's an oil? What's a bomb? What's a vape? What's legal? What's safe? I sit among you with lots of questions. And your questions today are really going to drive this program because we want you to leave better informed. And for that, I am delighted to be joined by our panel. So our first panelist is Dr. Gavin Brown, a neurologist with the Laureate Medical Group, a wonderful supporter of Jewish Home Life, Weinstein Hospice, and a terrific and easy person to talk to. So he also told me to not tell you, but I'm going to tell you, he may or may not be an active crime fighter. Thank you, Dr. Brown.
So, I hear there's been a lot of buzz about today's presentation. I get it. All right, good. I think I'm going to give a very sort of short overview of the use of THC oil and medical cannabis products in neurological disease. And I'll tell you, I think it's important to say that my views do not express the views of Laureate Medical Group or the Northside Hospital System, who I'm employed by. So, smoking marijuana is still illegal. I'll start there. So, the possessing or smoking the cannabis plant in Georgia is not legal. I mean, I think that's an important starting point. The laws around it have changed, and some of them have actually changed recently in several counties in Georgia. But there are no circumstances under which you can possess and smoke marijuana for any medical condition. However, what is legal in Georgia, and I would say what I have now a fair amount of experience with, is low-potency THC oil. It has been legal to possess and use for medical conditions in Georgia since 2014, and every year since it became legal, the indications for it have expanded. Just like any conversation about the topic of cannabis or THC, there are politics behind sort of how it became legal and why certain indications are approved. But what I would tell you is that there are now 14 different reasons why you can become registered by the Georgia Department of Health and possess low-potency THC oil. An interesting fact about it is that your body, your brain, spinal cord, and immune system, you are born with endocannabinoid receptors, which are receptors that the cannabis and CBD products activate. It's interesting because there's not a substance your body makes that activates many of those receptors. And that in itself has sort of been a topic for basic science research. Why are you born with some THC receptors that only cannabis activates? Most of them are in the brain, and spinal cord, and they're spread throughout systems that involve memory, emotions, and pain regulation. There are a lot of cannabis receptors, different types of them, in the immune system too. And I think Dr. D will probably address that. And the one indication that has been studied the most for in terms of what I do, and the one neurological indication that's been studied the most is multiple sclerosis. There are several large European trials, none that were done in America, that show that it clearly impacts both pain and spasticity, which is stiffness that patients experience in MS. Now, it's been anecdotally reported, which means, that there aren't trials, but that it's sort of been widely either accepted or described to help a lot of other things, including epilepsy, which many people know about. It's actually the way that the Georgia THC law, the reason that it came around was because there was a little epileptic girl named Haley, and the law is called Haley's Hope Law, and her parents moved her from Colorado to here. She has a terrible form of childhood epilepsy called Dravet syndrome, which basically nothing works for, and she had been started on medical cannabis. She'd been started on THC oil in Colorado, and it was working pretty well. And so when Governor Deal was the governor, her family started sort of a grassroots lobby, convinced him to, after much politics, convinced him to enact this law, and epilepsy was the main reason why. Interestingly, the use of cannabis for epilepsy has not gone through a randomized controlled trial. Now, that's the gold standard of proof in Western medicine. It is taking one group and giving them the treatment, taking the other group and giving them a control, and seeing how they compare to each other. Again, the gold standard of proof for us, but that does not necessarily mean that it doesn't work. And in fact, I think there are several underway that haven't been published, and despite that it hasn't been proven in a trial, there is actually now a FDA-approved drug that's a derivative of cannabis called Epidiolex, which has been approved for use in epilepsy, and it's approved to use when everything else fails in something called refractory disease. So it's not something that you can use as a first line, but it's there, and it is FDA approved. The FDA has not officially sanctioned the use of cannabis for anything else. It's not on or off label. There is no label other than Epidiolex, unless I'm mistaken. Dr. D may know something I don't there. I can tell you the other conditions that it's approved for to use for in Georgia are Alzheimer's disease, interestingly. Again, no studies, lots of anecdotal reports that it helps to calm agitated behavior in Alzheimer's disease. It's also approved for autism, post-traumatic stress disorder, and neuropathic pain. And I think that I probably, in my practice, probably use it the most for its pain indications. It's my personal opinion that we're in an opiate crisis. Everybody knows this. I imagine if I asked you to raise your hands if you had been impacted by it or know somebody who has, lots of you would raise your hands. My opinion is, why wouldn't you try this as an option rather than committing to opiates? Many doctors may not share that opinion, but I think in terms of safety, it's a no-brainer for me. I use it a good bit in multiple sclerosis. I can tell you from my practice that probably where it makes the biggest difference is patients with MS who have spinal cord lesions. So in other words, patients who have, where MS has affected either their neck or their thoracic spine in the middle, and it causes them to feel stiffness and pain in their legs that really not much else works for. In my experience, and I think probably you would hear this from a lot of neurologists, that's where it seems to have a very robust benefit. All the other drugs we use to treat that are sedating, addictive, and you put it all on the scale, they're not really worth it. So I do have probably the second most experience with MS. Pain is number one. I've used it in Alzheimer's, and I'll tell you anecdotally, it's another situation where patients with Alzheimer's or any type of dementia that comes to a stage where a patient is agitated or upset, it is probably a much better alternative than the drugs we use there too, because many of them are antipsychotics or sedating. And I've had sort of mixed success with it. An important big picture concept also is we have the oil that's approved for use. It's 5% THC by volume. That's what you can use. 5. The patients who I have used it in, and I've got over 100 patients registered with the Georgia Department of Health, all have 5% oil. What we don't know, though, is you can tell them to get this low potency oil. You can tell them to start using it. There's not a specific guideline, there's not a guideline or even really trials to look to as to what dose do you use, how do you titrate it, and what do you anticipate in terms of side effects. So the simple answer is I start very low in the dose, and I titrate it very slowly, and I meet with them regularly. In my experience, low-potency THC oil is very well tolerated. I have not had a patient yet who felt high or who even really felt like too sleepy from it. Some patients, it's oil-based, and they're tinctures. It's drops that you use out of a little bottle. And so some patients, the base they use, which just varies from peppermint to other things, it can upset their stomach. But other than that, it's been, again, in my experience, very well tolerated. What else can I tell you? Oh, and another important indication in the state of Georgia is Parkinson's disease. It's another thing that it's used a lot in Europe for PD, like it is for MS. And it probably works the same way as it works for multiple sclerosis, because Parkinson's patients, some of them have spasticity or stiffness, and that's visible if you know anybody who has Parkinson's disease who shuffles or has trouble getting up out of a seat. It seems to help okay for those symptoms. It's hit and miss for those. What else can I tell you? The American Academy of Neurology in 2014 came out with a guideline about this. So I guess the official stance of my big academy is that it works for MS, and that that more research is needed, which is always frustrating. It's a common conclusion of medical studies, and that for everything else, it's probably effective. So they came out with a sort of a maybe on everything, but it definitely works in MS. And I guess I would tell you that reflects my personal experience as well.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. This is my good friend, Dr. Dubovsky, from recently retired from Atlanta Cancer Care, but always somebody who took outstanding care of his patients and was really creative in making sure that they got what they needed to be comfortable.
So I think it's important for you to understand very simply the language we are going to use. Cannabis. Only two things are important. One is the hemp species, and the other one is marijuana, spelled sometimes with a J, sometimes with a H. By law, anything over 0.3%, not what it says on the bottle, but 0.3% is illegal. I don't care how they package it, how they label it. I'll be interested to hear what Brad says about it. The nice thing about being stopped when you're carrying a card that has been given to you by people that are registered is that no one can actually test what you got in your car because they don't know what the hell they're doing. And so the arrests for marijuana, apparently, et cetera, have just collapsed because the force throughout America has no idea how to actually rule what is and what isn't. So I want you to know about hemp. I want you to know about marijuana. There is recreational use, there's medicinal use, and I've summarized all of that. And the thing that is the most bothersome at the moment is the synthetics that are being done by what I call the dark side. And that is not the dark side of government. This is not the so-called putative deep state. This is another deep state, trying to separate you from your money and your life. And they are being effective in both areas, trust me, if you've been looking at the news recently. Let's understand something about hemp. It is in everything. It is in the rope that we used during the Civil War that kept our Navy afloat. It is in all those things that I've outlined there, okay, and is a massive opportunity for farmers in the Depression who were running out of crops to grow hemp for industrial use. And I packaged just in the corner the hemp seeds. I can go to Whole Foods or Publix and buy hemp hearts that I put in my smoothie. No one's going to arrest me. I mean, the worst thing that happens is I'm not constipated. That is not illegal. And by all means, enjoy your hemp hearts. What's really important is this distinction between plant cannabinoids and the internal system. And there actually are circulating stuff that does interact not only with its receptors, but also with what's happening outside coming in. And I'm just going to call them CB for cannabinoid 1. You can see the spectrum, and CBD2, which interests me because you'll see it in white cells, lymphocytes, immune reactive cells, bone marrow, spleen. It's an interesting network, and what we are looking at in this network is the cannabinoids being one part of a massive system. And it was all sorted out by this gentleman in Israel not that long ago who discovered the endocannabinoids. So, real simple. The phytocannabinoids are the plant family. And it's not just the marijuana plant, but you can get things that I've never heard of before, like black truffles and the ginseng and the echinacea and stuff that is actually very familiar to you. They also belong to a similar family. The pharmaceutical side was touched on with the anticonvulsant, and we'll touch on very briefly the use of a drug called Marinol for anti-nausea in people getting chemotherapy, appetite stimulation, and a lot of this took off during the California HIV epidemic, where people were wasting, dying from anorexia, malnutrition, amongst all the other things. And we may touch on that if you're interested in asking questions. The dark side is when you start using certain solvents and certain additives to your vaping, and then you die. And we've got, 300, almost 400 cases now that the CDC is looking at. And so the old adage of caveat emptor, let the buyer beware, really is important, because when Gavin says, I believe that you should have an opportunity to try this, my question is, what the hell is this? The hemp is real simple. It has to have less than 0.3%. The marijuana plant is an incredibly hybridized plant. It is promiscuous to the ultimate degree. I don't even know that anybody says that, I smoke or I vape or I drop marijuana or what have you, that they know what they're doing. Because every plant, every boutique that is growing their own stuff, whether it's in Holland, whether it's in California, or whether it's in Kentucky, has got its own hybridized plant. And the first thing they do, and a lot of the audience will understand this, If you want to grow, I'm told, a good marijuana plant, and I have no experience with this, keep the male plants away as far as possible, because then what happens is that the resin that the female plant is putting out to attract the male just keeps on doing its thing, and the yield from that plant is explosive. One male plant can totally destroy the yield in a otherwise, let's call it marijuana farming community. So the better these people are getting at growing their and hybridizing their marijuana, the higher the THC levels are getting, 20%, 30%, 40%. And this is a highly psychoactive drug. CBD is not psychoactive in the slightest, and if there's anybody in the audience and our esteemed panel who has other information, I'd like to hear that. Most of you at the moment are in a CBD mode, which is a quiet, blissful, relaxed, about to fall asleep. And what you need is a little bit of that other stuff, but I'm afraid it's not here. So I don't want to bore you with the what's happening at a federal level, but at a Georgia level, this is the HB 324, the law that we spoke about. And where does cancer come in? Severe or end stage. And this is the list as of when last I looked at it. And if you're interested, Atlanta Magazine had an interesting article, and that is we are allowed to register people if you are properly licensed to do that, to be able to carry not more than, I think it is 20 mLs of 0.3% or lower containing CBD oil. But where do you get it? Because you can't grow it here. So our governor is very cleverly, I'm told, told the University of Georgia and I think one other university and a couple of places, you will be able to grow it, but not yet. Okay, so I don't know what this not yet means. This was a Consumer Reports, January 19, a lot more interesting than refrigerators and whether you should buy a Honda or a Toyota. And they looked at people, this is just part of the survey, as to what type of CBD, whatever that means, do you use. The majority of people are eating it infused in a drink, and there's a rumor that Coca-Cola's denied that they're busy looking at infused drinks, and they strenuously denied that because it's not politically correct. A fair amount of people are using it as tincture on their tongue, sprays in their mouth. Then we've got this insidious vaping problem, and a fair amount of that, fair amount of topical and rubs, and I've got a CBD cream on the area I'm sitting in front of that someone I've trusted over years and years said, you've got to use this for your muscle cramps. And I've been rubbing it in and praying, rubbing it in, not praying, nothing happens. And it's not the CBD's fault, it's obviously something wrong with my receptors. And so it goes. People are also using vaginal suppositories, rectal suppositories, you name it. If you got any thought, someone's already made it. And the question is, there was always a political concern from Nixon through Reagan. Carter was a good guy, apparently. Bush, not so good. This is not a political discussion. As to marijuana being a gateway drug. If you go into marijuana, you're going to get sucked into something else. And the answer is it isn't. It's actually an exit drug, where if you look at the cancer population, where they check the urine, and there have been 1 or 2 studies, and Emory has actually contributed a little to that. They showed that people who were taking whatever they were taking when they had THC, and this was not on the registration, okay, had less smoking, less alcohol, and a tendency to less opioid use. Not necessarily so. Half of this group didn't take any medication at all. So I'll speed it up a little bit. People wanted it for anxiety, joint pain, better sleep. There's a difference between the so-called millennials and the people who are perhaps a little older as to what they were using it for. And when we come to cancer, here is the major frustration because of the politics and the use of marijuana laws and the drug enforcement agent. And if any of you are lawyers, I think in 1868, there was a law called posse comitatus that said American forces are never allowed to be used on American soil. And a certain president who will remain nameless that in the 60s basically got Congress to add and change that law, so much so that the American army was now allowed to be used on American soil as part of the war against drugs. They just say no. And basically it wasn't a war against drugs, it was a war, and this is not a political thought, it was a war against people who basically Nixon and Reagan didn't like, who were making them look bad. And so the important thing about the cancer side is that there's an enormous amount of cell culture work where people are looking at petri dishes and looking down the microscope, adding different chemicals and showing that there are products from these plants in one form or another that can slow down cell growth, cancer cell growth, inhibit the cell cycle, interfere with tumor masses putting out new blood vessels without which they starve. Okay, that's angiogenesis. And can interfere with invasion of the environment and metastasis, which is spread from one place to another. And I'll just show you this one. The problem about that is that when you're in a tissue culture, there's no environment, there's no milieu interior, there's nothing. It doesn't translate into clinical research. It's very interesting for drug development, and we may touch on that. But in the animal world, there is no question that if you look at animal tumors of various kinds, those receptors that we have so widespread in our body are present in and on cancer cells. Breast cancer lines, brain particularly, a lot of data on brain, and the only damn study of CBD on PubMed, which I researched this morning so I wouldn't get caught by you, a very smart audience who had done the search ahead of me. There's one study looking at a CBD with radiation, period, for glioblastoma multiforme. And so we've got all these teasers out there where there are cell lines and human biopsy showing that breast cancer, for example, has CB1 and CB2 receptors. What are we going to do about it? Well, just give them a little bit of this, whatever this is. And we'll touch on that very briefly. And so this is a 2016 article out of JAMA Oncology that said it had no value. I can show you the very next one that is a 2019, January of this year, that looked at the literature and came to a conclusion not too different, and that said we need more research. But you can't do research when the government doesn't allow you to do research, when the history of the whole drug war doesn't allow you to do research, when marijuana is a Schedule I drug that says it is no medical use, and there's a lot of pressure to change that. And it's been very difficult to get anybody to study this thing. And so here's the one study, okay? And there's no question that it seems to prolong the survival of people with breast tumors. The biggest role, and I'll wrap it up, is basically for symptom control, nausea, vomiting from chemotherapy. But when a young Hodgkin's patient tells me, and I'm allowed to use a four-letter word? Okay, my shit is better than your shit. When I gave him Marinol and Ativan and every and if anybody's ever had nausea that racks you for days and days and days and days on end, you have no idea how doctors can make people sick in the hopes of making them better. Sleep disorders, and I won't go into all of that. Peripheral neuropathy, so we give people chemotherapy that gives them toxicity, and it's known, it's discussed, it's anticipated. And then having done that, we've hopefully helped them, and let me not be negative and nihilistic, and cured their cancer, and they left with a walking pain impediment for the rest of their lives. There is a role for this in that. Please read this book. Smoke Signals. It's the definitive book. It's a little out of date, but it's unbelievable for me, learning experience as to how on earth did medical science get itself trapped in the absolute inability to study something, and I have to support what Gavin's saying, you've got nothing to lose. But you've got to get this right. And so there's one company, and I did a quick look at this an hour before I came here, so I skipped lunch, which is why I'm ill-humoured at the moment. And there's a company down in Florida, I won't mention names, that has got a pipeline where they have created exactly the chemical they want, and it's got a name, BCR1014X. And there's a study in colon cancer looking at the standard chemotherapy triplet in 2 groups of people, which are otherwise matched. One group is getting their pipeline CBD product. This is now very specific, like aspirin is very specific, right? And so this is the beginning, I think, of a crack in the wall, and that's not meant to be a pun either, just came to me. Sorry about that, Gavin. You started a bad part of my brain going. So I welcome any discussion. The problem is that the marketing and the business and Wall Street, if you look at the stock market and you look at some of the cannabis shares, it's unbelievable, is completely outweighing the data. So it's about time we got caught up with the data. Thank you.
We've heard from 2 brilliant physicians. Now we have a brilliant pharmacist. Brad Cherson is a pharmacist at Pavilion Pharmacy. It's a compounding pharmacy near here. Thank you, Brad.
Well, thank you, and all the speakers before me that have lined me up, I guess. Just to kind of preface, I guess I'm a believer in natural products. I grew up with a father who was a pharmacist and readily gave me Paragaric to calm me down. So opium has been in my system for quite a while, and I guess I just carried that, into also being a pharmacist. But the type of pharmacy that I have works a lot with integrative medicine, works a lot with natural components, works a lot with both traditional medicine as well as incorporating a lot of these modalities. So when I'm dealing with a lot of people, and I see them from everywhere from MS patients to patients that have trouble sleeping, patients that have trouble staying awake, hormonal issues, I mean, you name it. We see everything. And a lot of the way I practice pharmacy is I like to be engaged in talking to them, finding out what the real issues are. If I have a question from somebody, then there's usually a basis behind that question. There's something that I need to dig out in many cases. So when somebody new comes in and says, hey, I just want some CBD, I heard about it on the news, the question is, what are you going to use it for? How are you going to use it? Why you want to use it? Is it going to substitute for your traditional medical care? Is it going to augment that care? Or am I going to just totally tell you this is not appropriate for you if you're using it, going to discontinue your traditional medical care? So it's not just an easy, like, here it is, see you later. So from my standpoint as a pharmacist, when we started looking at carrying these products, my first inclination was, well, how can we get a product that's going to say what it is on the label, that's going to do what it's supposed to do, and is going to be reproducible? Because as a pharmacist, if I'm weighing out 30 milligrams of a drug, it's got to be 30 milligrams of that drug plus or minus 10% if you want to get technical about it. But if I'm using a balance and, it's got to be accurate. So our first basis in choosing how we supply this is, how do I find something that I can hand out, that I know what's in there, and that I can be confident that the label stated is going to be what's in the bottle. So that was the first basis when we were vetting products. So there's lots of products out there. I mean, you can go to the convenience store on the corner, and then, you know, we carry CBD hemp, or you can go to some of the mass merchandisers might carry some of these, and creams, lotions, topicals, balms, you name it. But I mean, I kind of narrowed it down to just a few things that I could give to somebody and say, there's 1,000 milligrams of full spectrum CBD in this bottle. It doesn't matter if your bottle that you brought me is labeled 2 million milligrams, what is that based on? So my basis was, I want a product that I can have a certificate of analysis on, and that's one key part of choosing a product, that wherever it's being purchased, you can go and look up a certificate of analysis, and it'll show what's in that bottle. So I had to have that availability, and you know, the only thing I can do is relay like some of the experiences I've had with people coming in, repurchasing it, telling me what they're using it for. Of course, the opioid crisis has been huge, and we've had lots of people that have come in and used this to replace those uses, and it's been quite successful. There's always going to be people, it doesn't matter how well it works to them. They still want to take opioids. I can't help those people. But it's a matter of reproducibility to me. Recently, which was kind of encouraging, and like I said, there's no real studies that we can dwell on. I just have to go by talking to people and asking them, you know, how things are working out for them. I have a physician I work with that's located in Costa Rica as well as in DC, treats a lot of veterans. So he refers people to us for CBD, and had to ship some to a young lady in Las Vegas who lives in Costa Rica but was visiting Vegas. And I asked her what she was using it for, and her child was having 20 seizures a day, reduced down to 2, was also additionally autistic, and was an agitated autistic, so it greatly reduced that agitation. So those are signs that, although they're not formal studies by any FDA or any other agency, that I have to go on to figure out, well, is this helping or not helping? So that's what I use. As a pharmacy for us, and having to deal with our Board of Pharmacy, DEA, you name it, CDC, all the other names of agencies, but especially for the Georgia Board of Pharmacy, for us, being a pharmacy might not be the same if you go into a convenience store, but for us as a pharmacy, we have to make sure it has the 0 THC in it. So unfortunately, people that come in are not laughing. They after they use my product, because they're getting 0 THC, but they are getting the full amount of the vital component that works both for all the different aspects that we've been talking about. So that's one concern I have as running a pharmacy, is making sure that I can have that data to show when possibly an agent comes in and wants to see the bottle, but they're generally not going to take it and go analyze it. They're just going to see it on the label. They would want us to produce that data. So you know, from a pharmacist standpoint, dealing in a pharmacy, that's what I have to be concerned about. So again, when I'm talking to people, I try to figure out what they want to use it for, how they want to use it. A drop would be mostly used for faster action. It would work faster because you have a gland under your tongue and it would carry it right into the bloodstream. You can also adjust the dose a little bit better, because if you needed only a half a milliliter, then you could measure out a half a milliliter. If you needed a full mil, you could measure out more. If you needed it more often, you could do that. So you have the ability more to adjust dosing with a drop. Another form that a lot of people tend to like are just gelatin capsules. So you just swallow it. It's a set dose. You don't have the ability to really adjust it except by taking more of them. One thing that can be done if somebody does want a capsule, as well as have a little bit of the value of a drop, is you could just squish the capsule in your mouth and stick it under your tongue, or puncture it with a little needle and squeeze it. But most people don't want to go through that hassle. They'd rather just do it with a drop. And generally the third one would be like a topical balm. And that would just work locally on the area. I wouldn't expect it to be absorbed too high into the bloodstream for other central uses, but mostly for isolating in that area. So somebody with severe back pain, or they injured their elbow, it could be used on those spots, just those spots. So, so those are generally the dosage forms. I mean, there's all kinds of lotions and things. There's also drops that have other, typically natural ingredients in it, maybe melatonin. Some people will add melatonin. Some people will add turmeric, some other boswellia, some other natural components. And that's more, in my opinion, a marketing scheme. I mean, I would rather just have the drug, know what's in there, and be able to use it as stated on the label, and I can do a better job of talking to people and adjusting and maybe tweaking it to their needs. And that's pretty much how I work. So, yep.
I want to thank each of our panelists for the great information that they provided. This is such a vital topic, and we're so grateful to the London family for bringing it forward. You know, in hospice and palliative care, the patients and families that I see are genuinely suffering. And anything that we can do to help manage those symptoms and find a way to do it better and get people more comfortable is an important conversation, I think. One of the first questions we received, and this is to all three experts, is, in your experience, has anyone ever fatally overdosed from cannabis? Dr. Brown?
No. I think Timothy Leary there's a quote about this, and I'm pretty sure it was Timothy Leary. He said, "The only fatal dose of cannabis is a 20-pound brick dropped off a 10-story building."
Okay. Another question. Maybe we'll start with Brad. What is the difference between THC and CBD?
Well, the THC is the tetrahydral cannabis, and that's the psychoactive component of the plant. The CBD is the part of the plant that is the cannabinoids, and that's the one that interacts. Every mammal has a cannabinoid system, so even your pet hamster could take CBD if you've got a hamster-related illness. So you've got the CB1, CBD2 receptors. So the CBD interacts on those receptors. So CBD1 is generally for the nervous system. CBD2 are generally for the organs, more receptors towards that nature. So the CBD specifically acts on that. There is some enhancement with THC. It's a terpene, part of the terpene family. So some of the manufacturers have kind of figured out they can mimic THC by using another terpene. The most common one is called beta-carotene, and putting that in there tends to enhance the CBD part. I don't know if anybody has any formal studies on that, but I think it's more theoretical, but I guess they figured that if that particular type of component was added into the CBD, it would enhance its effect. I tend to think in some of the products that I carry, there is beta-carotene in there. It doesn't affect the psychoactive component, just the effect on those particular CBD1 and CBD2 receptors in the body.
Thank you. If you use CBD or THC products over time, does the body get too used to it where it doesn't work that well anymore over time? In other words, does the dosage/potency need to be increased?
You know, there actually is some science relating to that. There's one study which looked at the fact that after 3-4 months, the users of CBD were slowly escalating their doses. And this came from an ambulatory pain center, not from a cancer center.
Great. Thank you. And I think this next question is very important, asking, can you comment on drug interactions with CBD oil? Please, to anyone who is using any of these products, be forthcoming with your healthcare providers about what you're using, because I'll leave it to the panelists to comment on any potential drug interactions with CBD oil. Dr. Brown, Dr. Dubovsky?
That's an important question. It's something I address with all of my patients who I use THC oil for, and the simple answer is we don't know. The longer answer is it has been studied a little bit. There's actually some data that is available through Sloan Kettering's website about herbs. It's the largest sort of herbal and alternative medicine database in the world, I think. And the contexts that I use THC oil for, as you saw and the indications that were listed, are generally for refractory diseases. In other words, I've tried everything else and it didn't work, and the patient is miserable or disabled by what we're using it for. And so in those cases, it's sort of just an honest conversation that we're going to use a little bit. I am uncertain. In fact, to become registered to use THC oil, the Georgia Department of Health requires that patients sign a waiver, and it's a liability waiver that basically states the same thing, that we don't know. My sense is that it is still probably safe to use in most of those cases. And if the alternative is horrible seizures, if nothing else has worked for, if the alternative is, it's a spastic MS patient who can't walk, everything has failed. If it's someone who's in a lot of pain and they can't live because of that, they can't do what they need to do day to day, in those cases, it's an honest conversation. Another important indication for THC oil that, I think we missed, maybe you touched on it, is hospice patients in Georgia are approved to become registered and to use THC products.
End-stage cancer for palliative care. So on the one hand, one's got the emotive element of being a physician, and that is, on the one hand, it's first do no harm, but surely, first do good comes into play as well. And so if you look at the science, there's a drug that we use, for example, for colon cancer called oxaliplatinum, and the cannabinoids may interfere with its metabolism. And what is more global is that there's a sophisticated enzyme system called the cytochrome, and they got all kinds of names I won't bore you with, CPY450, et cetera, which are part of the liver's metabolizing drugs, and the cannabinoids will interfere with those as well. So be aware that there is the potential to either augment a drug or, for that matter, subtract from the efficacy of the drug. And that doesn't go for antibiotics, by the way, because it's real interesting. We haven't touched on that. But, and they learned this in the antiviral days, that it has anti-HIV effect, and it's actually recently been shown to be working together with antibiotics for a certain group of bacterial infections, which are pretty common. But beware, if you've got to let your physician know, because so many people are taking blood pressure, cholesterol, and a whole slew of drugs. Don't just willy-nilly throw something into the mix there without your physician knowing. And there are drug interaction checkers that cover, believe it or not, CBD of one sort or another. If you're interested, we can put that up on your website.
Thank you. How does CBD help people with dementia? Specifically, does it help keep the memory, or does it only help with the anxiety? Dr. Brown?
To my knowledge, it has not been shown to preserve memory circuits. Its indication, at least in Georgia, is for advanced dementia where agitation or a behavioral disturbance is part of the clinical picture. I do have mixed success with it there, but it doesn't help to preserve memory as far as I know.
Thank you.
The flip side, there's an interesting flip side of that actually, though, because there was a big study that came out in JAMA a few years ago that looked at patients who smoked marijuana. They looked at cognitive function and memory in patients who smoke marijuana. And they came to an interesting conclusion, and it was a retrospective study, which means that it was surveys they gave people, which means that it wasn't perfect. No study is. But it was a large study that drew the conclusion that even patients who smoke marijuana regularly, again, illegal in Georgia, but those patients did not appear to sustain long-term cognitive side effects or memory loss when they stopped. It's not conclusive, but it was very interesting that it looked like patients who even were regular marijuana smokers for decades, when they stopped smoking for a period of time, when they stopped using it, they performed as well as age-matched controls who had never smoked marijuana, on all kinds of testing of cognitive function and of memory. Now, testing cognition is, it's as accurate as cognition is variable. And so, the tests, there you go. Again, the tests just aren't perfect. But I found that study to be very interesting.
Excellent. This is for any one of you that chooses to chime in. How long does it, either THC or CBD, stay in your system? And is there any reason to be concerned about drug testing for work or insurance? A lot of deep nods.
Yes, it depends on how you're taking it. Because if you are vaping it and you are inhaling it, you get a quick, whereas if you take it as a chewable, it's going to take longer to have its effect, but have a longer duration. So you can't score on both sides. So if you want anxiolytic effect versus duration of effect, you may have to mix it up a bit. And I challenge you to do that, because when I last looked at Amazon and put in CBD, I got, you want to guess how many answers as to products? 6,000. So, you pays your money, or, you take your chances, or you have a legitimate, this is science. Whether it works or not is neither here nor there, but this does not have contaminants. This does not have heavy metals. This does not have any of the bad stuff. And this is not meant to be a plug, but it's the first time I've ever been close to this, so I'm sort of just moved aside a little. So I've been using this, and I can tell you, this doesn't work off Amazon.
And it also depends on the test, because there are drug tests that might test a broad amount, and there are tests that might just specifically test for THC. And if you're with an employer, you may not know which ones. I have a friend of mine works for one of the hospitals, and he's like, they're just going to run the cheapest tests, and they're going to test for all the cannabinoids and THC. So if somebody was just taking a CBD alone, it might pick up on that. So, it's unfortunate that possibly somebody working at a hospital, or maybe fortunate, depending on which one they were using, but if they're working at a hospital, but they needed some sort of relief other than an opioid or some other muscle relaxant, lifting patients, this, that, or the other, that they could use something that's not going to affect their mental ability, but society's not going to look at it that way, or the employers, or their risk of liability. So they pretty much generally, I think, just stay away from it just because they don't know how that test is going to run.
Perhaps just a comment and a question as wagging the tail of the dog here. The full spectrum is a very complex chemical, and may in effect give you a little bit more trouble with urine testing than a very specific, this is the chemical, rather than full spectrum. And so there's this tug of war between I'm going to get more effect from a full spectrum, but I may get a little bit more on it because they're flavonoids, they're all, this is where the smell comes from. This is where the taste comes from, is the company that the cannabinoid keeps. Is that a fair comment? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. And it will vary because it's a natural product. So, the color might vary, the time of the year that it was harvested, the distillation method. So every now and then I'll get a call saying this looks like a different color than it was the last time, but it may have been when it was harvested and processed. So, so you have all those variabilities that you would have in any natural product. So.
And again, if you don't mind, just another, it also depends apparently whether you extract the chemical using a solvent, because this is only dissolved in fat. This is not water soluble. So if you look at all of these products, you'll see that they all contain a medium chain triglyceride or what have you, so it makes them fat soluble. But the issue there is if you're using CO2 extraction, you get a completely different product from the same plant using a solvent. And then the question comes, what solvent? Because that's some of the problem that the vaping industry is running into. This is complicated chemistry. So you started by trusting not what it says on the label, but whence it cometh from. Yeah.
So I guess the question is, though, if I'm using CBD oil for back pain and I get randomly drug tested by my employer, am I at risk, and how do I protect myself?
If you work for a federal agency, you absolutely cannot test positive. I have actually an attorney who is a patient who uses it for an indication, who assures me that in Georgia, if you're registered, that the law is on your side. I mean, I don't, if companies are vastly different, of course I'm not an attorney, nor would I offer you legal advice. I tell everybody who I give it to check, who is employed, to check with their HR department to see if they I basically put that ball in their hands. And I can tell you that I have patients who work for big private companies, and it's okay as long as they're registered and they disclose it, that it didn't put their job or doesn't put their job at risk. As far as, kind of another practical question, your patients say, well, can I work with this? Well, I tell them the same thing that I tell my patients I give pain medications, anticonvulsants to, any medication that I prescribe that can have cognitive side effects or performance side effects. I say, it's just common sense. Tell me, if you feel that it impacts your ability to think, to drive, come back and it's probably not going to be worth it, we'll put everything on the scale. In my experience, most of the seizure drugs I prescribe impact patients' ability to think, remember, and drive more than the THC oil that I use, in my experience.
Thank you. This would probably be mostly for Brad. What is the cost for CBD oil, and does insurance ever cover it?
Definitely not insurance. So it would be out of pocket. I would say generally a bottle of this size with the amount of CBD that's in there runs about, I think it's around $98. The capsules for 60 are, I think, $139. And then the salve is, I think, around $72. So depending on how frequently and how much is being used would depend on how long it'll last. But I have a few people that use the drops and only use about 5 drops a few times a day for pain management. And that's going to last them, she comes maybe every 45 days or so and gets a bottle. So it would depend.
The reason why this is expensive and some other stuff is cheap is that the certificate of analysis, I went and looked into some of the machinery, that it's not just any certificate of analysis, because you need a laboratory that has been certified and has been monitored with the same diligence, I would like to think, as Pfizer or Roche or any other drug company that's looking after your blood pressure medicines, beware cancer, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so the moment you start adding a COA in a lab, you cannot buy this cheaply. You buy cheap, it's not been certified. That'd be my naive take on it. Yeah.
So, also, Brad, what would be the difference between obtaining these products from a pharmacy versus a dispensary? You're seeing all these signs pop up over town, CBD oil sold here, but it's not a traditional pharmacy. So, would you like to comment on that?
What we're seeing is huge marketing efforts. A lot of people have seen a opportunity to jump on the CBD hemp oil bandwagon for everything under the sun. And so what's available in like some of the stores, and I guess maybe I should have poked my head in and looked around, and there's probably some pretty decent products out there, but how do you know? I suppose they could show you a certificate. It's almost like going into a GNC and asking for something for a multivitamin. You've got a wide array. Does it need to be, are you gonna ask somebody that's in high school that's just working there as a cashier versus somebody that might have a semblance of medical knowledge to at least assess how it's being used and all the parameters that goes into vetting a supplier? It's not to say there's not good products out there, it's just how do you differentiate? And then also to incorporate the medical use for it, if that's what's, if that's the specific intent. If somebody's just wanting to do it, just because they heard it or something and they wanted to give it a shot, well, that's a different story. But if you're trying to work with somebody on a medical basis, then you probably want to talk to somebody that understands medicine.
If I can comment, I think the single most important thing, if I was in the audience, and I am in the audience, would be hearing what both of my colleagues here are offering. On the one hand, what have you got to lose? On the other hand, if you don't do it right, you've got a lot to lose. So this is doing it right. About 2-3 years ago, 4 years ago, and there's a theme to this, the New York State Attorney General sued GNC, Target, Walgreens, and Walmart for fraud because they went into their stores and randomly selected supplements and did DNA banding analysis and showed that most of the contents bore no resemblance to the label. In essence, it was filler and rubbish. Wouldn't do you any harm, but you were just, what can I tell you? And then, and so they quickly fixed that, I would think. I don't know. And then on the other hand, there's been some recent data looking at mislabeling of CBD products, and I didn't put that in this slide deck, and about 40-50% of products in this study were completely mislabeled. A lot of it was over, which would obviously bring you back again because you're getting some psychoactivity, and a fair amount of it was under from the point of view of the THC.
Yeah, the supplement industry, this doesn't fall into, I guess, probably the category of a supplement in the FDA's eyes, but supplements that do, it's not a well-regulated industry to begin with. I mean, I think that also goes back to, it's an important thing, goes back to the question of, well, will this interact with my drugs? I have a large number of patients who I treat come in with a list of supplements that they're taking and have the same question, and my answer, you can research it a little bit with the database that I referred to before at Sloan Kettering, and it's pretty helpful, but there again, if ultimately the question is, will this interact with what I'm taking, and is it harmful? Even for supplements that have been FDA approved, my answer is often, I'm really not sure. I have a soapbox I get on there, but I'll stay off of it.
Well, let's just say, in general, whether it's buying any product, you get what you pay for. In the supplement industry, you can go in and find thousands of brands of, say, a vitamin B6, but which one has some data behind it or is produced in a, the way I would approach vetting a product is it made in a good manufacturing environment, a GMP plant, which means that there is some oversight into how something is being produced, and you'll see that. What we do on a daily basis as a pharmacy, and especially as a compounding pharmacy, is finding suppliers and finding resources that can provide me with chemicals or drugs that are USP grade, which stands for United States Pharmacopoeia. So that gives me the standards, knowing that it's been looked at and that those certificates are available. And if it's made in a good manufacturing plant from nutraceuticals, that's generally going to say that that product is having some oversight, that probably what's on that label is in that label, better than just running in and getting something from maybe the grocery store that you don't know what's in there. It all goes back to price versus quality in many cases.
The FDA sent out a number of warning letters, and there are people who are willy-nilly putting this in as food additives, food supplements. You can buy gummy bears, not for your hamster, but for your dog. I guess you can break it in half and give it to your dog. So it doesn't bite you anymore, Carol? Now just your doctor bites you. Yeah, be that as it may. It's complicated, but quite simply, if you got a standardized product that has gone through standardized testing, and it is at the same level as the FDA-approved drugs that you trust. We are all our own control. And if you are in desperate times, desperate means you are entitled, not because of the Right to Try Act, there is actually a right to try law that precludes anybody from stopping you getting a non-FDA approved drug. I don't think it's ever been challenged in the marijuana world, but no drug company will supply it to you. So you can have as many rights as you like if you don't have access to it. But why would you not go for a clean, proper, analyzed product, and then you will say, I'm feeling better, or I'm not, etc. No one's ever died from CBD, unless the CBD has been used with a solvent that, or it's got krypton in it, what's it called? No, that's not. There's this thing called krypton. It's an underground synthetic cannabinoid from China that people have been putting in their vaping stuff to get a high. And well, you've got to protect yourself from that.
It's an important
consumers
distinction.
can't be stupid.
Very important distinction. Thank you. Probably start with Dr. Brown. How does CBD help with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder? And does it enhance cognitive behavior therapy results?
I don't know the answer to the second question. For number one, THC, cannabis derivatives, including CBD, have been studied and shown in anecdotal studies. So, it's people sort of reporting what they see, not structured clinical trials, but they've been shown to reduce anxiety, and there is a small study that showed that THC seems to reduce the startle response, which is sort of strongly augmented. It's your fight or flight reflex in PTSD patients. I think those were probably the basis behind using it for that indication. And George, I can tell you, I probably only have a couple, you could count on one hand, the number of patients who I use it for in PTSD, because usually they do need kind of a psychiatrist captaining the ship. And a lot of the time that's actually, there's a head injury that's part of it, and that's why I'm on the case.
Dr. D or Brad, anything to add?
If you go back and you look at the post-Vietnamese, what was going on in California that was busting the government's gut, they were not messing around with CBD. I mean, this was basically THC, no nonsense. Jerry Garcia's wife and all kinds of interesting stories you can riff on. But the war veterans congregated to those communes for finding peace.
No doubt. Another population greatly in need of treatment for their suffering. This will be our last question. What can an elderly person who suffers from anxiety expect in terms of improvement or mitigating the symptom of anxiety?
Hopefully it'll work. I mean, in conversation, when I'm using it for patient, in the indications where anxiety is part of it, and that's whether that is a agitated patient with dementia or PTSD, there's a lot of secondary anxiety and epilepsy with refractory seizures that understandably also generates anxiety. But they have to have failed everything else that is standard. And if they have, then I guess I would set the expectation that it's unlikely to make things worse. And, it's a little bit of trial and error, but it often does work for anxiety. So if I were starting it for one of those indications, I'd be a cheerleader and say, let's cross our fingers. And it's worked, in my experience, in a small number of cases.
Yeah, but if I take a pedestrian attitude towards this, and I was just thinking, so I come home, and I was a medical oncologist, and this is just a story, it's not true, and I was really stressed. I could buy a bottle of really good single malt Scotch whiskey that it cost me about $100, minimum, which is not good for my liver, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Or I could try this, and I would tell you within a week which was the better value.
Fair enough.
Not to say, I mean, or both. No, you don't want to do both. Yeah.
Right.
A lot of Scotch drinkers here, okay? Which is why you're all looking so young. I must congratulate you.
And just going back to my story of the autistic child, I mean, and that's got to be a very complicated, neurology aspect, and it seemed to help with that. And most of the stories or the reports I get from people repurchasing it is it did help to kind of just level it out and just reduce the firing of the anxiousness. So, but there's all levels of anxiety and there's all reasons, and so, but in general, exactly, it's like, what do you have to lose? It's either the scotch or the CBD, and this has got to be better on the liver.
I mean, how much does a month's supply of Ativan cost, or a month's supply of antidepressants? And how safe is that for you when you're on the 400 at 3 o'clock in the morning? I don't know.
I want to thank our panelists for everything that they contributed and all the information.